What happens when a legendary music icon sits down for what should be a simple morning chat, only to be met with relentless accusations and dismissive comments from a host who refuses to listen? In just 38 seconds, a single loaded question would unravel into the most explosive confrontation morning television has ever seen, exposing a host's entitlement and leaving a beloved star with no choice but to walk away. The morning started like any other on the popular daytime show. The studio lights blazed bright, the audience settled into their seats, and the cameras prepared to roll. Cliff Richard, the legendary singer with decades of hits and millions of fans worldwide, had agreed to appear as a guest. He was there to talk about his new music, his upcoming tour, and maybe share a few stories from his incredible career. It was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be fun. Nobody expected what was about to happen. Lorraine Kelly greeted Cliff with a smile as he walked onto the set. The audience clapped. Cliff waved, looking relaxed in a smart blazer and open-collar shirt. He sat down on the couch next to the other panel members, a mix of regular contributors and special guests who were there to discuss the day's topics. Everyone seemed cheerful. The energy was light. But something was different about Lorraine today. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a tightness in her smile. The crew noticed it. The panel noticed it. And soon, Cliff would notice it too. Lorraine started the interview with pleasantries. She asked Cliff about his weekend, about the weather, about how he was feeling. Cliff answered politely, his voice warm and friendly. He was a professional, someone who had done thousands of interviews over his long career. He knew how these things worked. But then Lorraine shifted gears. Her tone changed. The questions became sharper, more pointed. And that's when the tension began. Lorraine leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Cliff. She said, "So, Cliff, there's been a lot of talk lately about older artists still performing. Some people think maybe it's time for certain performers to, step aside and let the younger generation have their moment. What do you think about that?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with a pin pulled. The panel members exchanged glances. The audience went quiet. Cliff blinked, clearly surprised. He gave a small, polite smile and said, "Well, I think music is for everyone, isn't it? Age doesn't really matter when it comes to passion and talent. I still love what I do, and my fans seem to enjoy it, so I don't see why I should stop." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, gracious, even. But Lorraine wasn't satisfied. She pressed on, her voice taking on an edge. She said, "But don't you think there's something a bit, desperate about clinging to the spotlight when you're past your prime? I mean, you've had your time, haven't you?" The room went cold. One of the panel members, a younger entertainment reporter, looked down at her notes uncomfortably. Another panelist, a comedian who had been joking around moments before, stopped smiling. The audience shifted in their seats. This wasn't the friendly morning chat show they had come to see. This was something else entirely. Cliff's smile faded. He sat up straighter, his jaw tightening just slightly. He said, "I wouldn't call it desperate, Lorraine. I call it doing what I love, and I'm not sure why you'd frame it that way. I've been making music for over 60 years, and I'm proud of that. My fans are still with me, and that means the world." Lorraine waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing away his words. She said, "Oh, come on, Cliff, let's be honest here. How many of those fans are just nostalgic middle-aged people clinging to the past? When was the last time you actually had a hit? When was the last time anyone under 30 knew who you were?" The panel members looked horrified. The entertainment reporter leaned over and quietly said, "Lorraine, maybe we should." But Lorraine cut her off with a sharp look. She said, "I'm just asking the questions everyone's thinking. Someone has to be honest." Cliff took a breath. You could see him trying to keep his composure. He said, "Lorraine, I came here to talk about my new album and my tour. I didn't come here to be insulted. I don't think it's fair to suggest that my career or my fans are somehow less valid because I'm older. That's ageism, plain and simple." Lorraine laughed, but it wasn't a warm laugh. It was cold and cutting. She said, "Ageism? Really? That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? I'm just saying what everyone can see. You're not relevant anymore, Cliff. You had your time. Why can't you just accept that and move on?" The comedian on the panel spoke up, his voice careful but firm. He said, "Lorraine, I think you're being a bit harsh. Cliff Richard is a legend. He's sold over 250 million records. He's been knighted. Show some respect." Lorraine turned to the comedian, her eyes flashing. She said, "Oh, so now you're defending him? Just because someone's been around forever doesn't mean they deserve a free pass." This is my show, and I'll ask whatever questions I want. The atmosphere was crackling with tension now. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every uncomfortable moment. Cliff looked at Lorraine, his expression calm but his voice firm. He said, "You know what, Lorraine? I've been in this business for a very long time. I've dealt with tough interviewers, difficult questions, and challenging situations, but I've never, in all my years, been treated with such blatant disrespect." Lorraine rolled her eyes. She said, "Oh, here we go. The victim card. Classic." Cliff shook his head slowly. He said, "This isn't about being a victim. This is about basic courtesy. You invited me here as a guest. The least you could do is treat me with a modicum of respect. But clearly, that's too much to ask." The entertainment reporter tried again to intervene. She said, "Maybe we should take a quick break." And, Lorraine snapped, "We're not taking a break. We're in the middle of an interview." Cliff stood up. The movement was sudden but controlled. He removed the microphone, clipped to his jacket, and placed it carefully on the couch. The studio went completely silent. Every eye was on him. He looked at Lorraine and said, "No, we're not. This interview is over." Lorraine's face went red. She said, "You can't just walk off my show. Sit back down." Cliff smiled, but it was a sad smile. He said, "Actually, I can, and I am. I came here in good faith, Lorraine. I came here to share my music and connect with your audience. But you've made it clear that you have no interest in having a respectful conversation. You just wanted to tear me down, and I won't be part of that." The panel members sat frozen, unsure what to do. The audience was completely silent, watching this surreal moment unfold. Lorraine stood up too, her voice rising. She said, "This is ridiculous. You're being oversensitive. It was just a few questions." Cliff turned to face her fully. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. He said, "No, Lorraine, it wasn't just a few questions. It was a deliberate attempt to humiliate me on live television. You called me desperate. You said I wasn't relevant. You dismissed my fans. You laughed at me. That's not journalism. That's cruelty." The comedian stood up and put a hand on Cliff's shoulder. He said, "Cliff, mate, you don't have to explain yourself. Everyone here knows you're in the right." The entertainment reporter nodded in agreement. She said quietly, "This has gone way too far, Lorraine." Lorraine looked around at her panel, clearly surprised that they weren't backing her up. She said, "Are you all serious right now? I was just doing my job." The comedian shook his head. He said, "Your job is to interview guests, not attack them. There's a difference." Cliff began walking toward the exit. Lorraine called after him, her voice sharp. She said, "If you walk out that door, you'll regret it. Do you know how many people would kill to be on this show?" Cliff stopped and turned back one last time. He said, "You know what, Lorraine? I don't think I will regret it. In fact, I think this is the best decision I could make. I've spent my entire career treating people with kindness and respect. I've worked with hundreds of interviewers, journalists, and hosts, and I've never walked off a show before. But there's a first time for everything. And I'd rather walk away with my dignity than stay here and let you continue to belittle me." The audience started clapping. It began with just a few people, but within seconds, the entire studio audience was applauding. They were clapping for Cliff. They were supporting him. Lorraine looked around, stunned. Her own audience was turning against her. Lorraine raised her voice over the applause. She said, "Oh, so now you're all on his side? Unbelievable. He's the one walking out. He's the one being unprofessional." The entertainment reporter stood up and addressed the audience. She said, "Actually, Lorraine, I think Cliff has been nothing but professional. You, on the other hand, have crossed a line, and I think everyone here can see that." Lorraine's face went from red to pale. She realized what was happening. Her panel was turning on her. Her audience was against her. And the cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of her downfall. She tried to regain control. She said, "We need to go to a commercial break. Now." But the director's voice came through the speakers. He said, "We're staying live, Lorraine. This is what's happening." Cliff gave a small nod to the audience, acknowledging their support. He looked at the panel members and said, "Thank you for speaking up. It means a lot." Then he walked off the set. His steps were steady, his head held high. He didn't storm off. He didn't slam anything. He simply left with grace and dignity. As Cliff disappeared through the studio doors, the applause grew louder. The comedian looked at Lorraine and said, "You know what you just did? You attacked a legend, a genuinely kind, talented man who has never done anything but bring joy to people. And you did it for what? For ratings? For controversy? Was it worth it? Lorraine tried to speak, but her voice wavered. She said, I was just asking tough questions. The entertainment reporter shook her head. She said, there's a difference between tough questions and personal attacks. You know that. We all know that. And what you did today wasn't journalism. It was mean-spirited and unnecessary. Another panelist, an older woman who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. Her voice was measured but firm. She said, Lorraine, I've been coming on this show for years. I've always admired your interviewing style, but today, I didn't recognize you. That wasn't the Lorraine I know. That was someone trying to score cheap points at the expense of a guest, and it was wrong. The audience continued to murmur amongst themselves. Some were shaking their heads. Others were talking quietly about what they had just witnessed. The energy in the room had completely shifted. What started as a typical morning show had turned into something nobody would forget. Lorraine looked around desperately, trying to find someone, anyone, who would support her. But there was no one. Even the crew members were avoiding her gaze. She had gone too far, and everyone knew it. She tried one more time to defend herself. She said, he could have just answered the questions. He didn't have to make such a big deal out of it. The comedian let out a bitter laugh. He said, are you serious? You insulted him repeatedly. You questioned his relevance, his career, his fans. You laughed at him. And you think he's the one who made a big deal? Lorraine, you created this situation. This is on you. Thanks for watching. Bye. Entertainment reporter added. And now the whole world is going to see it. This is live television. There's no taking it back. Lorraine's hands trembled slightly. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She had pushed too hard. She had been too aggressive. And now, in front of millions of viewers, she had driven away one of the most beloved figures in British entertainment. And her own panel had turned against her. It was a complete disaster. The older panelist spoke again, her tone softer but still serious. She said, Lorraine, I think you need to really reflect on what happened here today. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a moment that showed a side of you that people haven't seen before, and it's not a good look. Lorraine sat back down slowly, her confidence completely shattered. She looked at the cameras, at the audience, at her panel. Everyone was watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. For the first time in her career, she was completely lost. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know what to say. The comedian stood up and removed his microphone too. He said, you know what? I don't think I want to be here anymore either. This isn't the show I signed up for. And with that, he walked off the set as well. The entertainment reporter hesitated for a moment, then followed. One by one, the panel members left. They couldn't stay. They couldn't be associated with what had just happened. Lorraine sat alone on the set, the empty couch beside her a stark reminder of how quickly everything had fallen apart. The audience was silent now, watching her with a mixture of shock and disappointment. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every painful second. She tried to speak, to say something to salvage the situation, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? Finally, the director's voice came through again. He said, Lorraine, we're going to cut to commercial now. And the screen faded to black, but the damage was done. The moment had been broadcast live to millions. Social media was already exploding with reactions. Clips of the confrontation were being shared everywhere. People were outraged. They were defending Cliff and criticizing Lorraine. The backlash was immediate and intense. Backstage, Cliff was being comforted by members of the crew. They apologized profusely for what had happened. One crew member said, "We're so sorry, Cliff. That was completely out of line. You handled it with such class." Cliff smiled kindly and said, "Thank you. It's not your fault. I just wish it hadn't come to that." His manager was already on the phone, dealing with the fallout. But Cliff himself seemed calm. He had done what he needed to do. He had stood up for himself. Back on the set, as the show returned from commercial, Lorraine tried to continue as if nothing had happened, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. She stumbled over her words. She couldn't focus. The audience could see it. The viewers at home could see it. She had been exposed. Her entitlement, her arrogance, her willingness to tear down a guest for the sake of controversy, it was all out in the open now. The remaining segments of the show were awkward and uncomfortable. Without her panel, Lorraine had to carry the show alone, but she couldn't. Every smile felt forced. Every comment felt hollow. The magic of the show, the warmth and friendliness it was known for, was gone. In its place was something cold and bitter. The show that had brought joy to millions every morning had become a cautionary tale about what happens when a host forgets that their guests are people, not props. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the show ended, Lorraine sat in the empty studio. The audience had left. The crew was packing up. She was alone with her thoughts. She had wanted to create a moment, to make headlines, to prove she could ask the tough questions, and she had succeeded. But not in the way she intended. The headlines weren't about her hard-hitting journalism. They were about her cruelty. They were about how she had driven away a legend. They were about how her own panel had abandoned her. Cliff Richard, meanwhile, left the studio with his head held high. He had come to share his music, to connect with fans, to spread a little joy. Instead, he had been attacked. But he hadn't retaliated. He hadn't stooped to Lorraine's level. He had simply walked away. And in doing so, he had shown the world what true class looked like. He had reminded everyone why he was a legend, not just because of his music, but because of his character. The silence in the studio was deafening. Production assistants stood frozen in the wings, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch this train wreck unfold. The makeup artist who had prepared Cliff earlier that morning stood with her hand over her mouth, shocked by what she was witnessing. The sound technician kept his headphones on, but his eyes were wide with disbelief. Everyone who worked on the show knew something had gone terribly wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't the Lorraine Kelly show they knew. One of the cameramen, a veteran who had been with the show since the beginning, slowly lowered his camera. He couldn't keep filming. He couldn't be part of this anymore. His colleague noticed and whispered urgently, "Keep rolling. We're still live." But the cameraman shook his head. He said quietly, "I don't care. This is wrong. I've filmed thousands of interviews on this show. I've never seen anything like this." The floor manager heard the exchange and rushed over, trying to maintain order, but even he looked disturbed by what was happening. In the control room, the producers were in panic mode. The executive producer was on the phone with network executives, trying to explain what was happening. His face was pale. He kept saying, "I don't know how this got so out of hand. I don't know what to do." The vision mixer sat at her console, switching between camera angles, but her hands were shaking. She had never seen a guest walk off before. She had never seen a panel abandon their host mid-show. This was unprecedented. This was a disaster. The moment would be replayed countless times, analyzed, discussed, debated. People would talk about it for years. It would become one of those rare television moments that transcends the screen and becomes part of cultural history. But beyond the drama, beyond the headlines, there was a simple truth at the heart of it all. Respect matters. Kindness matters. And when you forget that, when you let your ego and your desire for attention override basic human decency, you lose. Not just the moment, but something much bigger. You lose people's trust. You lose their respect. And sometimes you lose yourself. The audience members filed out of the studio in stunned silence. They had come expecting a lighthearted morning show, maybe a cooking segment, some celebrity gossip, a few laughs. Instead, they had witnessed something raw and uncomfortable. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. She had been a fan of Cliff Richard since she was a teenager. Seeing him treated that way had genuinely upset her. Her friend put an arm around her shoulder and said, "He handled it so well, though. He was so dignified." The woman nodded, but she was still shaken. A young man in the back of the audience pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. He was drafting a post for social media, recounting everything he had just seen. He wrote about how Lorraine had attacked Cliff, how the panel had defended him, how the whole thing had spiraled out of control. Within minutes of posting, the responses started flooding in. People were shocked. They were angry. They couldn't believe what had happened. The post was shared hundreds of times, then thousands. The story was spreading like wildfire. Outside the studio, Cliff Richard stood in the parking lot with his manager and publicist. They were discussing what to do next. His publicist said, "We need to get ahead of this. The media is going to be all over it. We need to release a statement." But Cliff shook his head. He said, No statements. What happened in there speaks for itself. I'm not going to add fuel to the fire. I'm not going to turn this into a bigger spectacle than it already is. I just want to go home." His manager respected that. He always had. That was the kind of man Cliff was. Dignified, measured, never one to seek drama or attention. Back inside the studio, Lorraine Kelly sat alone in her dressing room. The door was closed. The lights were dim. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the person looking back at her. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes were red. She replayed the interview in her mind, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. But deep down, she knew. She had gone into that interview with an agenda. She had wanted to create a moment, to make headlines, to prove she could ask the tough questions that other hosts were too timid to ask. But she had crossed a line. She had confused being tough with being cruel, and now she was paying the price. There was a knock on her dressing room door. She didn't answer. The knock came again, softer this time. A voice said, "Lorraine, it's me." It was her assistant, someone who had been with her for years. Lorraine opened the door slightly. Her assistant looked at her with a mixture of concern and disappointment. She said gently, "The producers want to see you. They need to talk about what happened." Lorraine nodded slowly. She knew this conversation was coming. She knew there would be consequences, but she wasn't ready to face them yet. Not yet. The producers gathered in a conference room down the hall. The atmosphere was tense. The executive producer sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked tired. He looked disappointed. When Lorraine finally entered the room, everyone went quiet. She sat down without saying a word. The executive producer took a deep breath and said, "Lorraine, we need to talk about what happened out there. That was not okay. That was not the kind of show we produce. That was not the host we know you to be." Lorraine opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. We've received hundreds of complaints already. The network is getting calls. Social media is exploding. This is a public relations nightmare." Lorraine finally spoke, her voice small and defensive. She said, "I was just trying to ask challenging questions. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Isn't that good television?" The executive producer shook his head. He said, "There's a difference between challenging and attacking. You attacked him, Lorraine. You questioned his relevance, his career, his fans. You laughed at him. That's not journalism. That's bullying. And it's not who we are as a show." Another producer chimed in. "And then your entire panel walked off. Do you understand how bad that looks? Your own colleagues couldn't support what you were doing. That should tell you something." Lorraine felt tears welling up in her eyes. She said, "I didn't mean for it to go that way. I thought I was just being provocative. I thought it would make for good television." The executive producer sighed. He said, "Good television isn't about humiliating your guests. It's about connecting with your audience, telling stories, making people feel something positive. What happened today was the opposite of that. You made people feel uncomfortable. You made them feel angry. And worst of all, you made them lose respect for this show." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Lorraine had nothing to say. She knew he was right. Meanwhile, the panel members who had walked off were gathered in another room. The comedian was on his phone, scrolling through social media reactions. He said, "People are calling Lorraine out. Hard. And they're praising us for standing up for Cliff." The entertainment reporter nodded. She said, "Good. What she did was inexcusable. I've worked with her for years, and I've never seen her act like that. It was like she was a completely different person." The older panelist, who had been quiet for most of the show, spoke up. She said, "Power does strange things to people. Sometimes it makes them forget where they came from. It makes them forget that respect is earned, not demanded." The comedian put his phone down and looked at his colleagues. He said, "You know what the worst part is? Cliff Richard is one of the nicest people in the industry. Everyone knows that. He's never been involved in scandals. He's never treated anyone badly. He's just a decent human being who loves music. And she went after him like he was some kind of villain. It doesn't make any sense." The entertainment reporter agreed. She said, "It felt personal, like she had some kind of agenda, but I can't figure out what it was. Why would she want to tear down someone like Cliff?" The older panelist had a theory. She said, "I think she was trying too hard, trying to prove something. Maybe she felt pressure to be more edgy, more controversial. But she forgot the most important rule of broadcasting. You can challenge your guests without disrespecting them. You can ask tough questions without being cruel. She crossed that line today, and she's going to pay for it." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, processing everything that had happened. None of them knew if they would ever come back to the show. None of them knew if the show would even survive this scandal. As the day wore on, news of the incident spread beyond social media. Traditional news outlets picked up the story. Entertainment websites ran headlines. Television critics weighed in. Everyone had an opinion. And the overwhelming consensus was that Lorraine Kelly had made a terrible mistake. Some defended her, saying she was just doing her job as an interviewer. But those voices were drowned out by the chorus of criticism. Most people agreed that what she had done was unprofessional, disrespectful, and completely unnecessary. Cliff Richard, for his part, remained silent. He didn't give interviews, he didn't post on social media, he simply went home and tried to put the whole thing behind him. But his fans rallied around him. They flooded his social media accounts with messages of support. They praised his dignity and composure. They thanked him for standing up for himself. And they made it clear that they would always support him, no matter what. That meant the world to Cliff. In a moment of ugliness, there was still so much kindness and love. That was what mattered most. The show's ratings told the story of what happened next. Viewership dropped significantly. Sponsors expressed concern. The network received complaints from advertisers who didn't want to be associated with a show that had become synonymous with controversy and disrespect. The brand that Lorraine Kelly had spent years building, a brand based on warmth, friendliness, and positivity, had been severely damaged in the span of a single interview. It would take years to rebuild that trust, if it could be rebuilt at all. Lorraine Kelly had learned that lesson the hard way. In 38 seconds, with one loaded question, she had set off a chain reaction that would change everything. She had wanted to be memorable, and she had succeeded. But not as the bold interviewer who asked the tough questions. Instead, she would be remembered as the host who was so entitled, so dismissive, so cruel, that she drove away a beloved icon and lost the support of her own panel in the process. It was a cautionary tale that would be studied in broadcasting schools for years to come. A reminder that power comes with responsibility, that a platform is a privilege, not a right, and that respect should always come first. And Cliff Richard? He would be remembered for what he had always been, a gentleman, a professional, a legend who knew when to walk away. He had come to the show with good intentions. He had left with his dignity intact. And in the end, that was worth more than any interview could ever be. His fans knew it, his colleagues knew it, and deep down, even Lorraine Kelly knew it. She had tried to diminish a legend, and instead, she had only diminished herself. That was the real tragedy of that morning. Not that a guest walked off a show, but that a host forgot what it meant to truly respect the people who trusted her with their stories, their time, and their presence.